used to describe southern Libya is actually 3 times the size of Syria. So that gives you an idea of the kind of geographical spread of Libya, the vastness of the country. So its large size and the fact that the population of Libya is so small, 6 million, is one of the reasons why the use of mercenaries and other non-conventional fighters, foreign fighters, has spread so quickly. Because essentially when you have a geographical area so large with a very small local population, and I'll get into later the kind of nature of security forces during the Gaddafi period and what followed later in terms of domestic actors, domestic factions, particularly post-2014, in many cases had no other choice but to recruit foreigners in order to fight their battles. So what do we mean by mercenary in Libya? I know in one of your earlier sessions you were given a kind of a legalistic overview of the precise definition of mercenary. For the purposes of my own discussion today, I prefer, as I use it in the heading for my discussion, talking about non-conventional or armed actors, foreign actors. So in Libya, apart from the kind of traditional sense or idea of a mercenary, you also have PMCs, private military contractors of various nationalities and various types depending on the particular part of Libya. But to go back a little further to 2011 and the role of mercenaries in the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi that year, I think it's important to ask, first of all, what were the Libyan security forces like? What do they look like in January 2011, the month before the uprising against Gaddafi began rather? Muammar Gaddafi seized power in a military coup in 1969, and because of that, for much of his regime, he feared, having come to power himself in a military coup, he feared facing a similar challenge. So what he did was to hollow out the Libyan army, undermine the army, disempower the army until it was a shell of its former self. What he did instead was rely on battalions that were led for the most part by his own sons, so there was loyalty there for his own security. So the Libyan army during the Gaddafi era really became a kind of a shadow of itself, because Gaddafi feared a powerful military that could mount a coup against him. So that's important, I think, to remember here, because that particular dynamic tells a lot as well in terms of what developed in Libya post-2011, the fact that there wasn't a proper army in Libya in the true sense of the word, and the different armed groups that rushed to fill that vacuum. And of course, the question of mercenaries in Libya was not new in 2011. Before Gaddafi's overthrow, Gaddafi had himself developed the so-called Islamic Legion, which included a large number of soldiers from different African countries. That force served in Chad, also in Uganda and other parts of the continent, before being integrated into regular Libyan forces in the late 1980s. However, even after its dissolution, the Libyan armed forces continued to maintain units organized by ethnicity. And in 2011, as Gaddafi tried to snuff out the uprising gathering against him, he recruited fighters from other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there's a lot of debate over how many of these mercenaries were actually recruited, how many came to Libya, but for sure they are in the low thousands, or that is at least the kind of the most frequent estimate. And what was interesting was, in fact, I was in Libya in 2011. I was in eastern Libya in February, March, and April 2011, just as the uprising against Gaddafi was starting to gather momentum, and also at the time the UN resolution mandating the NATO-led intervention was passed. And what was interesting, if some of you may recall some of the media coverage at the time, was that very much a key part of the the uprising narrative or the rebels narrative was that Gaddafi was using mercenaries to try and quash the rebellion against him. And there were videos that were put out on social media purporting to show mercenaries that looked like black-skinned Africans wearing yellow hats. So they became known in Libya as the Yellow Hats. Now, what was interesting about these particular videos was that there were questions over whether these were actually mercenaries or whether they were migrant laborers, construction workers wearing yellow safety hats, and that they had basically been pulled into a situation beyond their control. I have to say that personally, my own experience on the ground in eastern Libya at the time, I remember visiting Labrak air base in eastern Libya and meeting men, dozens of men who were detained there. They told me that they were from Chad, that they were from Niger and other countries bordering Libya. And they claimed to me that they had been airlifted from southern Libya to Labrak, that main air base in the east near Benghazi, with the offer of work, essentially. They told me they had been in southern Libya looking for work, manual labor, etc., and that they had been given money or offered money to go to eastern Libya for work, but some of them said they were offered money to fight, as they put it. So there were very much those kind of stories around eastern Libya at the time. Later on, people were saying that this dynamic was exaggerated. But if we go back to the UN resolution 1973, which mandated that NATO-led intervention in Libya in 2011, it specifically mentions the use of armed mercenaries in Libya at that early stage. It deplores the language they use, the resolution deplores the use of armed mercenary personnel, as they put it. What's also interesting is that the arms embargo imposed in Libya at the same time in Security Council Resolution 1970 also mentions, also includes rather, armed mercenary personnel, and talks about the need for member states to monitor airports, seaports, etc., to ensure that those armed mercenary personnel, as the resolution puts it, do not get to Libya. What's interesting in relation to that arms embargo is that arms embargo still applies to Libya today. It hasn't been lifted since 2011, but there have been numerous violations of it. Numerous violations in terms of, particularly when it relates to Khalifa Haftar's forces, very blatant violations regarding the supply of weaponry into Haftar's forces in eastern Libya. But given what we know of the presence of various mercenaries and foreign fighters in Libya present as well, there's a violation in that respect. Also, going back to 2011 and related to the role of foreign mercenaries, whether we're talking about in the traditional sense or in relation to private military contractors, there was the role, alleged role of South African military contractors within Gaddafi's own personal security detail when he was killed just on the outskirts of his hometown in Sirte in October 2011. What we know of that is based on interviews that some of those South African contractors who were part of that security detail, or claimed that they were, gave when they returned to South Africa. So throughout 2011, we saw several different dynamics unfold in Libya relating to the use of mercenaries and other non-conventional foreign actors, security actors. So to fast forward then on to 2014 and the year that Libya tipped into a civil conflict, which still continues in different ways today, a civil conflict rooted primarily in a national power struggle, but also a conflict that has drawn in other regional actors. It's a conflict that where we have seen the Gulf crisis play out. So if you look at some of the external actors that are backing the Libyan factions in the civil conflict, on the side of Khalifa Haftar and his wider camp, you have Egypt and the UAE backing him with military and other assistance. On the other side, with within the anti-Haftar camp. You have Qatar and Turkey supporting different factions, but according to the UN panel of experts reports, the military assistance in terms of Qatar and Turkey is but a fraction of what the Egyptians and the Emiratis rather have been providing to the other side. The role of mercenaries then, apart from this external backing, to look at Haftar's forces first of all. Haftar describes his forces as the Libyan National Army, or LNA. Some Libyans will joke that that is a bit of a misnomer, in that Haftar's LNA is not truly Libyan, not truly national, in that it's based in eastern Libya, and not a real army. So what do they mean by not truly Libyan? This is a reference to the fact that it has been widely known since Haftar created his LNA with his Operation Dignity in May 2014, that different foreign actors were involved. And this definitely gained momentum later on, particularly in 2015. Why? Well, going back to the point I made earlier, what happened to the Libyan army during Gaddafi's era, but also Haftar, when he managed to bring together this alliance in May 2014, he claimed he was leading an army, but not every military officer in Libya supported Haftar or what he was trying to do. Particularly in Western Libya, there were a lot of military officers who rejected Haftar, rejected his LNA, and even in Eastern Libya, not every military officer signed up to Haftar's LNA. So he needed more fighters. He simply didn't have enough forces to project himself beyond Eastern Libya, which had become his stronghold, particularly from 2015 on. So, you know, Haftar, in terms of his need to project to external actors, particularly the UAE, Egypt, but also at one point he was trying to, and he's still trying to court Russia, trying to get Russian support. So trying to project himself and his forces is much more powerful than they actually were in reality on the ground in Libya. So there have been several interviews with Haftar where he has claimed to have 80,000 men under his command, which is a clear exaggeration. A senior AFRICOM official told me that their estimate of Haftar's forces was in and around 20,000, which included a significant number of what this official described as irregular forces. So we have seen, particularly over the last